Hi everyone, again from Cedar Rapids. I'm Bob Ask with my story. My story in the context of history that I lived, that I had a chance to study a lot, and of course, as a teacher for a long time. History as I lived it, studied it, and taught it. Today, in my third vignette of a series of 20, going over that life span, I have entitled my topic, More on the 1930s, Boyhood News and Memories, beyond that which we covered in our prior vignette sessions, the Roaring Twenties, and then last time we took a look at the political and world scene that was in our focus. Today, remember first of all how we framed the 1930s before we go into much more. The 1930s saw, as I frame it, three dominating themes. Trouble was approaching from both sides, the Atlantic and the Pacific, and would finally arrive to impact our country, of course, in 1941. It was also a decade of a long Great Depression that we outlined last time. And as our answer to all these world and domestic problems, we said was the election of this man here, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The Roosevelt aristocracy of New York came from two branches. There was distant cousin Teddy out on Long Island at Sagamore Hill, and then there was Franklin up on the Hudson at Hyde Park. This was the second of the two notable presidents by that name. Franklin Roosevelt, remember, was the surprise winner of the 1932 Democratic National Convention to go against Iowan Herbert Hoover. Remember the theme song that came from that convention and would become the Democratic Party theme song from then on was Happy Days Are Here Again. The skies above are clear again. So let's sing a song of cheer again. Happy days are here again. And they certainly were. The Democrats won in 32, 36, 40, and 44. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt would be a president and before his death for a total of 12 years. He was the only president I had from when I was just a little kid till I was in college. The New Deal had a lot of things to attend to, and with their new Deal program of alphabet soups, they did an amazing job, but also had some serious setbacks. Because of his running out of steam late in the decade, why, he even had to try to pack the Supreme Court to get justices that go along with his efforts at legislation. So he ran out of gas, and really the thing that solved the Depression, although it did a lot of good for a lot of people, including my first coach, who was a WPA employee, the thing that really resolved things, sadly, was the bundles for Britain to help our allies. And the thing that solved the Depression was the Second World War. So Today we go beyond that to other news, other headlines of this first full decade, which has so much impact on a young boy's life growing up. The way I look at it, at that point, I was viewing the big news and I was living my own little world of little news. You were always aware of the overall, but actually, as a little kid, you were more interested in winning the next neighborhood game on Saturday. I'd like to begin today with an update. Remember how we left the 1927 Lindbergh story? Well, we said it was Lucky Lindy, but it would not be lucky for very long. But before I capitalize that, let me point out an error. One small 4-letter word I omitted in talking about his trip in 1927. It was the first solo non-stop transatlantic flight. A couple of other fellows had beat him while they were together. The thing about Lindbergh, though, was his tragic conclusion of a wonderful life. He got involved with being too friendly to Germany, and people back home thought he was a little bit overly generous in his comments about the Nazis. And then, another thing, they started to think his policies were one of appeasement, when by that time the mood with the American people was, we better get into it or else. So that was the end of the Lindbergh story, and incidentally, he is buried in Hawaii on the beautiful Pacific coast of Maui, the Lindbergh story that we covered. There were 3 other major headlines, all negative in the 30s, that give you the climate of the country that I was born into. First of all, Mother Nature started to act up real badly. There was a tremendous drought in America in the early 30s. I can remember as a little kid walking across the grass that was so dry that it actually kind of crackled and bent as you walked along. That drought was most severe and worse in the southern plains, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, up into Colorado, and caused with the tremendous Great Plains winds, the dust storms, the Dust Bowl of 1933, 34, and 35. It was so bad, on one Sunday, April 14th, 1935, they called it Black Sunday. Just think, on that one day in 1935 in April, especially at the Panhandle area, 300,000 tons of topsoil was moved around where it wasn't any good. That dust impact, I can remember even as a little kid, you could look up in the sky and it wasn't quite so clear. And they say it was noticed even over New York and maybe even England. So the drought and the dust storms. And here is a picture of the remains. How terrible it was, and how the Okies and the Arkies, they called them, had to move out in their loaded down little jalopies. Where? California. Grapes of wrath, they called it in popular literature. Then a second big story in the 30s that I can remember as a little kid because it struck me so tragically as it did everyone else. Up to this time, there was a little competition between the airplane and the dirigible, or as Germany called it, the Zeppelin. On May 6, 1937, the huge Hindenburg, coming from Frankfurt, Germany, all the way to Lakehurst, New Jersey, just seconds over landing, blew up in a terrible, terrible crash. What caused it? They say in the gas that was used at the time, the hydrogen, and I guess you could say the whole thing was caused by 3 words: a spark from somewhere, a leak from somewhere, and the boom. A horrible night for Americans to watch. Luckily, 62 survived. Amazingly, miraculously, 36 were killed. The terrible tragedy of the Hindenburg, and that just about did it for the competition with the airplane. A third major line of headlines in the 30s was the crime and gangsterism that seemed to go parallel with depression and problems. Capone was in prison, and his more quiet, different type of lawlessness replaced by the gangsters of bank robbers, John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, Pretty Boy Floyd, and you perhaps still remember from the movies Bonnie and Clyde. John Dillinger, they finally got him walking out of a theater in Chicago, Illinois, where somebody squeaked on him, and they got him, John Dillinger, public enemy number 1, 1934. Well, fortunately, there was some good news, too, in the headlines. I can remember this one very vividly. The good news that came out of Canada, where a beautiful little set of quintuplets were born. And I can remember very fondly remembering their 5 names. There was Yvonne and Annette and Emily, Cecile and Marie. And I thought I was pretty good because some people could only remember 3 or 4. 5 beautiful little girls born in Canada, the Dion quintuplets. Now, also history, similar to for other boys, and to just not me, but all my fellow little kids in the neighborhood. First of all, there was a world of sports in our neighborhood. So big, so impactful, that I'm leaving it for a vignette all on its own. And we'll look at other things as of now. My story, lots of cowboys. Tom Mix, Buck Jones. I had a beautiful little cowboy suit. And of course, a gun in a holster. Everything was cowboys. And I loved that aspect of my boyhood. There was radio. Radio was big. We didn't have one in our house. Our neighbors, more fortunately, had one. And I'd go over every supper hour and listen to Jack Armstrong, the all-American boy. I can remember my mom sent in 2 Wheaties coupons to get me what they called a whistling ring. Why? If I was ever in danger and didn't want to speak out loudly, I could blow my ring. Here it is, a very favorite little artifact from my boyhood. Jack Armstrong, the all-American boy, and we can't forget little orphan Annie. And Amos and Andy. I always liked Amos and Andy. Amos, who said, you know, nowadays it's so bad, you gotta lie and cheat to prove you're innocent. Amos and Andy. And then there was the movies. Little Ottumwa, Iowa. Here we are in Depression, and can you believe we had 5 movie houses, 5 theaters, and more miraculously is perhaps the 3 greatest technological movies of all time were filmed that long ago. Just think, Gone with the Wind, Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs, The Wizard of Oz. And of course, there was Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire, who are now my favorites of that era, with movies like Swing Time and Top Hat, but they became my favorites when I got a lot older. Well, these were the big movies, but for me, costing a dime, I could go to the Westerns, or Shirley Temple, or Laurel and Hardy. Now, also in my life were all the little things that other people would know and that I just quickly move over because other little boys had stories probably somewhat similar. I read big little books. I loved just hanging out up at the neighborhood store, where if I was lucky enough to have a nickel, I could buy a bottle of root beer. I just loved hanging out on a summer day, and those summers back when I was a little kid seemed like eternities. There was walking to church with my family, a couple miles, but we had no car. I was talking to hobos. Because of the unemployment, every freight train that went through Ottumwa would have several of what were called hobos or tramps, like this one right here. And they would drop off at the next town, like Ottumwa, go through the neighborhoods. Why? For a sandwich. And my mom didn't have a lot, but we always had enough for a sandwich and a cup of coffee to a hobo as we gathered around him in the back lawn as he shared his story. Nice men, just no job and nowhere to go. They were a part of the theme. Well, there was also some shocking, violent scenes to get in on as a little kid. I can remember several times running down the hill to huge John Morrell and Company and watch the sit-down strikes, workers on strike during this difficult era. In 1937, I graduated from Garfield School, where it was sports, and for me and my buddies, 3 city championships: football, basketball, and track. But like I said, more on sports later. And there was a lot of special days. going to the swimming pool across town, going to Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus, the greatest show on earth. The county fair down at Little Eldon, where I got to see auto races and horse races. There were trips with my dad and sometimes my brother. Can you imagine going on a huge vacation train trip to Des Moines or to Davenport? And there was a time every 2 or 3 weeks in the summertime, we'd go out to Lake Wapello, constructed by one of those New Deal agencies, and one of our joys to use. Well, picnics in the park, playing volleyball with my brother and my dad even. These were all wonderful events in the 30s. Notice, no mention of Sports and Bobby. That's next time you'll want to tune in as we continue my story as I lived it and as I studied it, remember it, have now recorded. See you next time.